In April 1945, nearly 1,000 American soldiers went silent in Eastern Europe during the final push into Germany. None of them ever made it home. Among them was Staff Sergeant Robert Mercer's unit, 18 men who disappeared 3 miles from Soviet lines. The official report listed them as killed in action during heavy combat. The Army sent letters to 18 families, held memorial services, and closed the file. The men were honored as heroes who gave their lives for freedom. But 50 years later, when Lieutenant Dylan Mercer was overseeing a construction project at Fort Campbell training grounds, a bulldozer broke through a hidden concrete structure that had been buried beneath Kentucky soil since 1947. What he discovered inside would force him to uncover a conspiracy that reached far beyond his grandfather's unit, a systematic cover-up involving all those vanished soldiers. And the truth about why they never came home. The bulldozer's blade hit concrete at 9:47 a.m., and Dylan Mercer felt it through his boots before he heard it, that wrong kind of impact that said metal had found something it wasn't supposed to find. "Hold up!" He raised his fist, and the operator killed the engine. Silence dropped over the construction site, except for the wind moving through the trees at the edge of Fort Campbell's training grounds. April in Kentucky, the air still cool enough that Dylan's breath misted when he exhaled. He'd been at Campbell for 6 months now, assigned to the Corps of Engineers after 3 years at Fort Bragg. His performance reviews called him detail-oriented and thorough, which was officer speak for the kind of person they stuck on construction oversight while other lieutenants got the sexy deployments. Not that Dylan minded. He'd joined the Army to build things, to fix things. His grandfather would have understood that. Robert Mercer had been a carpenter before the war, before the 28th Infantry Division turned him into a staff sergeant, leading men through France and into Germany. Before he disappeared. Dylan walked to where the blade had scraped away 3 feet of Kentucky topsoil. Concrete. Old concrete, the kind with aggregate that looked hand-mixed, surface-weathered gray, and pitted from decades of freeze-thaw cycles. He crouched down, pulled his glove off, brushed dirt away with his palm. The surface extended in both directions, disappearing under the soil. Cold to the touch. Solid. "We got a problem, Lieutenant?" Sergeant Hayes came up beside him, hard hat pushed back on his head. Hayes was Tennessee National Guard, 20 years in, the kind of NCO who'd seen enough construction projects to know when something didn't fit. "Maybe." Dylan pulled his radio. "This isn't on any of the maps?" "You sure?" "I spent 2 weeks reviewing the site plans." Dylan stood, looked at the exposed concrete. "Every structure on Fort Campbell is documented. Every building, every bunker, every goddamn drainage culvert. This shouldn't be here." The plan had been simple. Grade this section of land for a new vehicle maintenance facility. Routine construction on what was supposed to be empty training ground that hadn't been used for anything since the base expanded in the 50s. Before that, it had been farmland, acquired by the Army in 1942 when they needed space to train divisions heading for Europe. Now they had concrete, where concrete shouldn't exist, and Dylan's morning had just gotten complicated. By noon, they had a 12-foot section exposed, not a foundation. A roof, curved slightly, built thick, 18 inches of reinforced concrete, with what looked like ventilation shafts running up through the soil. The shafts were capped with steel grates, rusted through in places, barely visible above ground level. Someone had gone to considerable effort to hide this structure. "Could be an old ammunition bunker," Hayes said, standing with his hands on his hips, staring down at the concrete like it had personally offended him. "Some kind of storage from back when this was farmland." "Then it would be on the base maps." Dylan walked the length of the exposed section, measuring his paces. Roughly 60 feet. "Everything gets documented when the Army takes over property. Every structure, every well, every septic system. You can't just lose a bunker." "Maybe it predates the takeover." "That was 1942. Dylan stopped, looked at the weathered concrete again, the way the aggregate had started to separate in places, the surface spalling from age. This could be that old, but why build something like this on Kentucky farmland in the middle of nowhere? "Civil defense?" Hayes offered. "Rich folks building shelters?" "Look at the construction." Dylan pointed to where they'd exposed a corner. "This is military engineering. German military engineering, if I had to guess. Hayes gave him a look. Germans weren't building bunkers in Kentucky, sir. No, but we were building things for Germans. Dylan pulled out his radio again. We had POW camps all over the South during the war, thousands of German prisoners working farms, doing construction. This could be something from that era. The base engineer arrived at 1300 hours with ground-penetrating radar and a 3-man crew. Major Patricia Vance, mid-40s, competent and no-nonsense, the kind of engineer who'd seen every possible construction complication and fixed most of them. She took one look at the exposed concrete and swore quietly. "You've got to be kidding me." "Wish I was, ma'am." By 1500, they had the outline, an underground structure roughly 60 feet long, 20 feet wide, buried 8 feet down. The GPR showed internal walls, multiple chambers, and an entrance on the eastern end, sealed with more concrete, poured over what looked like heavy steel doors. "This is a mess," Vance said, studying the printout. "We're going to have to halt construction, get a historical survey team out here, do an environmental assessment. Could be hazardous materials, unexploded ordnance if it's military, God knows what else." She looked at Dylan. "Your project just got delayed 6 months minimum." "We're not opening that today," she continued, pointing at the sealed entrance. "Need to assess structural integrity, get proper equipment out here, file the paperwork with base command, probably involve the Corps of Engineers Historical Division." The hillside chose that moment to make the decision for them. Later, they'd determine it was the vibration from the bulldozer combined with decades of water erosion that had weakened the soil around the entrance. The weight of the construction equipment above had stressed the underground structure. The ground had been slowly failing all morning, and the seal over the entrance, concrete poured in 1947, according to what they'd learn later, had been cracking for hours. In the moment, all Dylan knew was the sound, like thunder, but underneath his feet. The ground dropping away in a cloud of dust and cascading soil. Someone shouting, his own voice yelling for everyone to get back. And then he was on his back 10 feet from where he'd been standing, ears ringing, tasting dirt, staring up at the Kentucky sky while a section of hillside collapsed inward. The hole was large enough to drive a truck through. The sealed entrance had given way completely, steel doors twisted inward, concrete shattered, and behind it all, darkness. Deep darkness, the kind that had been sealed away for half a century. Dust rolled out of the opening, that underground smell, stale and cold and thick, air that hadn't moved since Truman was president. Dylan got to his feet. His hard hat was gone. There was blood on his hand from where he'd scraped it on something, but he couldn't feel it. Couldn't feel anything except the pull of that darkness, the sense that whatever was down there had been waiting a long time to be found. Hayes was shouting something about getting back, about waiting for engineering to assess structural stability, about following protocol. Vance was on her radio calling for medical, for structural engineers, for someone to tell her what the hell just happened. Dylan was already moving toward the hole. "Mercer, stand down!" He didn't stand down. He climbed over the collapsed earth, his boots slipping on loose soil, and dropped down into the entrance. His flashlight beam cut through the settling dust. Concrete walls, still solid. Steel support beams running along the ceiling, rusted but intact. A corridor leading deeper into darkness, angling down slightly, and on the floor just inside the entrance, something that caught the light wrong. Metal, small, stamped. Dylan's hand stopped halfway to picking it up. A dog tag, U.S. Army. The metal was corroded green, the chain broken, but the stamping was still readable in the beam of his flashlight. Walsh Edward J. 352-8729, 4 Opos Catholic. Dylan stood there, the tag in his palm, and felt something cold settle in his chest. American soldiers. Here. In a bunker that wasn't supposed to exist, sealed with concrete, buried and forgotten. His light swept the corridor. More tags, scattered across the floor like someone had dropped them running, like they'd torn them off and thrown them away, or like they'd fallen from necks when bodies had finally collapsed. He counted 6 before his beam found where the corridor opened into the main chamber. The bunker was larger than the GPR had suggested. 30 feet wide, ceiling 12 feet high, supported by steel I-beams that ran the length of the space. Wooden bunks built into the walls, 3 levels high, the lumber gray with age. A table in the center of the room collapsed on itself, the legs rotted through. Metal lockers along one wall, doors hanging open. And everywhere, scattered across every surface, the remnants of men who'd lived here. Boots lined up under bunks like their owners would come back for them. Canteens hanging from hooks. Tin cups on the table, one still upright, like someone had been interrupted mid-drink. A Bible with water damage blooming across its cover, pages swollen and stuck together. Letters, dozens of them, the paper brittle and yellow, ink faded to ghosts. Photographs curling at the edges, faces that Dylan couldn't quite make out in the dim light. And more dog tags. So many dog tags. On the floor, on the bunks, one hanging from a nail in the wall like someone had put it there deliberately, a marker or a memorial. Dylan moved through the space like he was walking through a grave, because that's what this was. Not a bunker, not a shelter, a prison. The walls showed it, scratches in the concrete, long gouges where something metal had been dragged back and forth. Marks where men had counted days, neat rows of lines that filled entire sections of wall and then stopped. Initials carved deep, messages scratched in desperate, uneven letters. Tell my wife I tried. Tell her I didn't give up. Someone had tried to dig through the wall in one corner, gouged the concrete down 6 inches with what looked like spoon handles filed to points. The concrete had defeated them. It always would have. You couldn't dig through 18 inches of reinforced concrete with a spoon, but they'd tried anyway. His light found a jacket hanging on a hook. U.S. Army, winter pattern, the wool moth-eaten and faded. The patch on the shoulder was still visible under the dust. A keystone, red and blue, bisected down the middle. 28th Infantry Division, Pennsylvania National Guard, his grandfather's division. Dylan stood there, staring at that patch, and for a moment he forgot to breathe. The 28th had been in Europe from Normandy through the end of the war. They'd fought through France, Belgium, Germany. His grandfather had been with them the whole way, a carpenter from Pittsburgh who became a staff sergeant who led 18 men and disappeared in April 1945, and never came home. Killed in action, the telegram had said, died with honor defending freedom. Dylan's hand shook as he moved the light across the bunks. Personal items on each one, organized like the men had expected to come back. A razor on a shelf carved into the wood. A deck of cards, the box disintegrated, but the cards still there, scattered like someone had been in the middle of a hand. A photograph of a woman holding a baby, the image faded but still visible. Dark hair, young, smiling at whoever was behind the camera. And on the bottom bunk nearest the entrance, placed carefully, deliberately, where it would be found first by anyone who came through that door, a notebook, leather cover, military issue, the kind officers carried for field notes. Someone had wrapped it in oilcloth, protected it from the moisture that had destroyed so much else. Dylan picked it up. The oilcloth cracked as he unwrapped it. The leather underneath was mildewed, the pages swollen with moisture at the edges. But when he opened the cover, the handwriting inside was still clear. Block letters, careful and neat, the work of someone who'd been taught penmanship in schools that still cared about such things. Journal of Corporal James Brennan, 28th Infantry Division, Company B, commenced 14th April 1945. The first entry was dated 3 days after his grandfather's unit went silent. Dylan's radio crackled. Hayes, calling from above, asking if he was okay, if he'd found anything. What the hell he was doing down there? Dylan looked at the journal in his hand, at the dog tags scattered across the floor, at the marks on the wall where men had counted days that turned into weeks, that turned into months, at the jacket with the keystone patch, at the photograph of the woman with dark hair who'd spent her life wondering what happened to the man who'd taken that picture. "Yeah," he said into the radio. His voice sounded strange in the dead air, hollow and distant. "I found something." He looked down at the journal again, flipped past entries dated April, past neat paragraphs that filled page after page, flipped past May, past entries that became shorter, more desperate, the handwriting less careful. The last entry was dated June 12, 1945, 5 weeks after Germany surrendered, a month after the war in Europe ended, 2 months after these men should have come home. Dylan closed the journal, stood there in the darkness of a prison that wasn't supposed to exist, surrounded by evidence of 18 men who'd been erased from history. And he thought about the telegram his grandmother had received in 1945. Killed in action, died with honor. Lieutenant? Hayes, more insistent now. You need to get out of there. Structure's not safe. Dylan looked around the bunker one more time. At the bunks, at the marks on the wall, at the dog tags that spelled out 18 names. One of those names was going to be Robert Mercer. He knew it before he started looking. He knew it in his bones. "Coming up," he said into the radio. He tucked the journal inside his jacket and climbed back toward daylight, toward the April morning and the construction site and all the questions that were about to start. Behind him, in the darkness, the bunker waited. It had waited 50 years. It could wait a few more hours. They sealed the site by 1700 hours. Yellow tape, armed guards, Major Vance on the phone with base command, trying to explain how a routine construction project had just uncovered what looked like a mass grave. Dylan stood outside the perimeter, watching soldiers erect a tent over the entrance, and thought about the journal pressed against his ribs under his uniform jacket. He should have turned it over immediately. Chain of evidence, proper documentation, all the procedures he'd been taught at West Point about preserving historical materials. Instead, he'd climbed out of that bunker with the journal hidden, walked past Hayes and Vance and a dozen enlisted men, and said nothing. Now it was evidence tampering. Now it was a career-ending decision. He didn't care. At 1800, Vance dismissed him. "Go home, Mercer. Get cleaned up. We'll need your full report tomorrow, but right now, you look like hell." Dylan lived off base in a rental house in Clarksville, 20 minutes from Fort Campbell. The house was small, mostly empty. He'd been there 6 months and still hadn't unpacked half his boxes. A card table in the kitchen, a mattress on the floor in the bedroom. The walls were bare, except for one photograph his grandmother had given him before she died. Robert Mercer in uniform, 1944, standing with his unit somewhere in France. 18 men arranged in 3 rows, all of them young, all of them smiling like they were invincible. Dylan set the journal on the card table. Made coffee he didn't drink. Stood at the kitchen window watching the sun go down over Tennessee hills while his hands shook and his mind kept returning to that bunker, to those marks on the wall, to the dog tags scattered like seeds across concrete that had become a tomb. At 1900, he sat down and opened the journal. The handwriting was neat in the early pages, each letter formed with care. Corporal James Brennan had been educated, maybe college before the war, the kind of soldier who wrote in complete sentences with proper grammar, even when he was documenting his own imprisonment. 14 Tattlers, April, 1945. We've been here 3 days now. The Germans moved us after the ambush. 18 of us left from what was supposed to be a simple patrol behind their lines. Sergeant Mercer says we got sloppy, thought the war was almost over, forgot that desperate men are the most dangerous kind. They brought us to this place yesterday. Underground bunker, well constructed, probably built earlier in the war when they thought they'd be holding this territory. The guards are Wehrmacht, not SS, which is something. They're older men, teenagers, the kind Germany's scraping from the bottom of the barrel now that we're pushing into their homeland. Mercer keeps us organized. Morning formation, cleaning rotations, physical training in the main chamber. Says routine keeps men from breaking. I believe him. Already saw what happened to Walsh. Kids 19 started crying last night, couldn't stop. Russo, our medic, sat with him till dawn. We can hear the war above us. Artillery, distant but constant. Soviet guns from the east, maybe American from the west. The guards know they're finished. You can see it in their faces. Dylan turned the page. The entry for April 15th was shorter, matter of fact. Brennan documented meals, watery soup, black bread, water that tasted of rust. He wrote about the guards rotating in shifts, about how they avoided eye contact, about the sound of bombing runs overhead that made dust rain from the ceiling. April 16th. Mercer found a loose stone in the wall. Thinks we might dig our way out if we're careful, if the guards don't notice. But the Germans are getting nervous. We heard gunfire above ground today, small arms, lasting maybe 10 minutes. Then silence. One of the guards came down afterward, young kid, maybe 17, his hands were shaking. April 18th. The guards left. Dylan stopped reading, set the journal down, stood up and walked to the window, but the darkness outside showed him nothing except his own reflection. The guards left. He picked up the journal again, just walked away. No warning, no explanation. We heard them arguing in German yesterday, heated conversation we couldn't follow. Then this morning, they were gone. Left the entrance unsealed, the door open. Mercer went up to check. He came back 10 minutes later, told us to stay put. His face was white. The war's moved on. We're in Soviet territory now. The Germans pulled back in the night, and the Red Army's already past us, pushing west. We're behind Soviet lines in a German bunker, wearing American uniforms. Mercer says we need to be careful about how we approach them. Says the Soviets might not be friendly, might think we're deserters or spies or God knows what. Says we wait until we hear American units, then make contact. So we wait. The next entries were dated days apart. Brennan wrote about rationing the food the Germans had left behind, about the weather turning warm, spring arriving above ground while they stayed in their concrete cage, about Walsh having nightmares, screaming himself awake, about arguments among the men. Some wanted to leave immediately, take their chances with the Soviets, but Mercer insisted they wait for Americans. 25th April, 1945. It's been 11 days. The food's almost gone. Russo says we need to make contact soon or we'll be too weak to travel. Mercer finally agreed. Tomorrow, he and I will go topside, try to find Soviet command, explain we're American soldiers in need of repatriation. I asked him what we do if the Soviets won't help. He didn't answer. Dylan read the next entry 3 times before it made sense. 26th April, 1945. They're killing prisoners. We found a Soviet patrol half a mile from the bunker. 4 soldiers, conscripts from the look of them, Asian features, maybe Uzbek or Kazakh. They took us to their captain, who spoke German but not English. We tried to explain using hand signals and the few Russian words Kozlowski taught us: American, friend, allies. The captain seemed to understand. Had his men give us water, bread? Then he told us to wait while he radioed his command. That's when we heard the gunfire. Behind the farmhouse they were using as headquarters. Single shots, methodical, one every few seconds. We couldn't see what they were shooting at, but we could hear the screaming between shots. German words, begging. Mercer grabbed my arm, told me not to react, not to show anything on my face. The Soviet captain was watching us. The shooting stopped after maybe 20 shots. Then silence. Then we heard a bulldozer start up. The captain came back 10 minutes later, very polite, said we'd have to wait for orders from higher command about repatriating American prisoners. Said it might take a few days. Communications were difficult. Everything was chaos with the German surrender coming. Said we should go back to our bunker. Safer there. He'd send word when they got instructions about what to do with us. We walked back in silence. Didn't talk about what we'd heard until we were underground again. Door closed, alone in the dark. Mercer made us all swear we'd say nothing about the shooting. Said it didn't matter, probably just Wehrmacht soldiers who'd fought to the end. Said we don't know the whole story, don't know what those Germans did, maybe they deserved it. But his hands were shaking when he said it. And when Walsh asked if we were going to try again tomorrow, try to find different Soviets to take us to American lines, Mercer said no. Said we wait for the Soviets to come to us. Said we keep our heads down and we don't make trouble, and we pray the Americans find us first. Dylan stood up, paced the small kitchen. His coffee had gone cold hours ago. Outside, Clarksville was dark, quiet, normal. People having dinner, watching television, living their lives without knowing that 50 years ago, 18 American soldiers had heard Soviet troops executing prisoners and realized they were trapped behind lines controlled by an army that might not let them go home. He sat back down, kept reading. The entries became shorter. Brennan documented each day with clinical precision. Soviet patrols passing near the bunker, the men staying inside, staying quiet. Food running out. Russo trying to keep everyone healthy on near-starvation rations. Walsh getting worse, talking to himself, Mercer having to restrain him during the night. 3 May 1945. Germany surrendered yesterday. We heard it from Soviet soldiers celebrating above ground. Singing, gunfire into the air, hours of it. The war in Europe is over. We should be going home. Mercer won't let us leave the bunker, says we wait for official word, for American forces to arrive, for someone to tell us it's safe. Some of the men are arguing with him now. Brennan says we can't hide here forever, says the Soviets are our allies, says we're being paranoid. But Mercer heard what we heard, saw what we saw, and he says no. 8 May 1945, VE Day, the official end. Europe is free. We're still underground. Food's been gone for 3 days. We've been drinking water from a stream that runs past the bunker, but Russo says we're all getting weaker. Walsh can barely stand. 2 others are sick with dysentery. We need medical attention. We need food. We need to get out of here. Mercer finally agreed. Tomorrow he and I go out again. Find Soviets. Explain we're American soldiers who need help. There's no reason they'd keep us. The war's over. Everyone wants to go home. Everyone. Dylan turned the page. The entry for May 9th was written in different handwriting, shakier, less controlled. The ink was smeared in places like Brennan's hand had been sweating. 9 May 1945. I'm writing this with Mercer sitting next to me. His hands are bandaged. I had to help him hold the pen. We went out this morning, found Soviet positions a mile east. Larger force than before, maybe a whole company, occupying what used to be a German supply depot. We approached carefully, hands up, calling out in Russian that we were Americans. They brought us to their commander, major, maybe colonel, hard to tell the insignia. He spoke English, educated, Moscow accent. Asked what we were doing here, why we hadn't reported to Soviet command earlier, why we were hiding in a bunker like criminals, Mercer explained. Captured by Germans, liberated by accident, trying to get back to American lines. The colonel listened, nodded, said he understood. Then he asked what we'd seen. Mercer said nothing. The colonel asked again, "What did you see? What did Soviet forces do? Did you witness anything unusual?" Mercer stayed quiet. The colonel smiled, said it was important we tell the truth, said there were criminals among the German prisoners, SS officers, war criminals who deserved justice. Said if we'd seen Soviet forces administering justice, that was a good thing, that was proper. Mercer said we hadn't seen anything. The colonel stopped smiling. He called in 2 soldiers, had them hold Mercer's arms. Then he took Mercer's right hand and bent his fingers back until 2 of them snapped. Mercer didn't scream, didn't make a sound, just stared at the colonel. The colonel asked again, "What did you see?" I broke, told him everything. The farmhouse, the shooting, the begging, the bulldozer. Told him we'd heard it all, that we knew what happened. The colonel nodded, said that was honest, said honesty was important between allies. Then he broke 3 of Mercer's fingers on his left hand, said these things we'd witnessed, they were complicated. Said the Americans wouldn't understand the necessities of the Eastern Front, the justice that needed to be done, the debts that needed to be paid. Said it would be better for everyone if we forgot what we'd heard. Said we should go back to our bunker. Said we should stay there until Soviet command decided what to do with us. Said that might take a while. We walked back. Mercer hasn't spoken since. His hands are swollen, the fingers bent at wrong angles. Russo did what he could, but we have no splints, no medical supplies. The pain must be unbelievable. But Mercer still isn't making a sound. I think he knows what I know. I think we all know. We're not going home. Dylan closed the journal, set it on the table, walked to the bathroom and threw up, coffee and nothing else, his body rejecting what his mind was trying to process. 18 American soldiers, buried alive, not by enemies, by allies, by the men who were supposed to help them get home. He rinsed his mouth, went back to the kitchen. The journal sat there, brown leather and yellowed pages. and Dylan knew he should stop reading. Should take this to Vance, to base command, to someone with authority to handle what this was. But it was his grandfather in that bunker, his grandfather with broken fingers. His grandfather who'd lived through something that command had decided to bury. Dylan sat down and kept reading. Dylan called in sick the next morning, first time in 6 years of service. He sat at the card table with Brennan's journal and read while sunlight moved across the kitchen floor and his phone buzzed with messages he didn't answer. The entries after May 9th documented a slow descent into something worse than imprisonment. Brennan wrote about the Soviets sealing the bunker entrance with concrete, working through the night while the Americans listened from below. About the ventilation shafts, how they'd tried to climb up, but the Soviets had welded grates over the tops 30 feet above ground. About Mercer's hands, how the broken fingers healed crooked because Russo had nothing to work with except torn strips of shirt for splints. 15. May 1945. Walsh died today, the dysentery combined with starvation. He was talking to his mother at the end, kept apologizing for something, over and over. Said he was sorry he broke her radio. He was 19, we buried him in the corner we've been using for waste. Mercer said words over him. The Lord's Prayer. Some of the men cried. I couldn't. I'm too tired to cry. We're down to 17. Dylan stopped. Checked the dog tag he'd photographed with his phone yesterday before the site was fully locked down. Walsh, Edward J., found near the entrance, right where someone would have set it after burial, a marker for a grave that was also a latrine because there was nowhere else to put a body underground. He kept reading. 22nd May 1945. Soviets came today, opened the entrance, brought food, bread, canned meat, water. Enough for a week, maybe. The same colonel from before stood at the top of the stairs. Didn't come down, just watched while his soldiers left the supplies. Mercer asked when we'd be repatriated, asked if there was word from American command. The colonel smiled. Said soon. Said these things take time, paperwork, coordination between allies. Said we should be patient. Then he left, sealed the entrance again. Kozlowski started laughing after they left. Kept laughing until he couldn't breathe. Russo had to sedate him with a sock in his mouth until he calmed down. Patient. We should be patient. It's been 6 weeks since Germany surrendered. The entries became sporadic after that. Days would pass without writing. When Brennan did write, the careful penmanship had degraded into something hurried, urgent, like he was racing against time or sanity. 3 June 1945. Mercer's making plans. Won't say what kind. He's been studying the ventilation shafts, measuring distances, calculating something in his head. His hands barely work anymore, the fingers healed wrong, he can't make a fist, but he's moving around the bunker at night, testing things. Some of the men think he's going crazy. I don't. I think he knows what I know. No one's coming for us. The Soviets are never going to let us go. We witnessed something they can't allow to become public. American soldiers who saw Soviet forces executing prisoners of war. That's a war crime. That's something that could poison Allied relations, maybe start a new conflict. So we disappear, officially listed as killed in action during the final push. Our families get telegrams. We get a bunker in the middle of nowhere. Mercer's going to get us out or die trying. Most of us are going to die anyway. Dylan's phone buzzed again. Hayes this time, the 5th call this morning. He let it go to voicemail. Outside, traffic moved through Clarksville. Normal Tuesday. People going to work, to school, to lives that didn't include reading about American soldiers being buried alive by their own allies. He forced himself to keep reading. 8 June, 1945. 3 more dead. Starvation, sickness. We've been eating 1 meal every 2 days, trying to make the supplies last until the Soviets come back. But they haven't come back. It's been over 2 weeks. Mercer says that's deliberate, says they're waiting for us to die. Easier than execution. Starvation leaves no bullet holes, no evidence of murder, just American soldiers who got lost in the chaos of war's end and died before anyone found them. He's right. I know he's right. We're down to 14. 10 June, 1945. Russo is organizing the strong ones for Mercer's plan. 6 of us can still stand, still think clearly. The rest are too weak, too sick. They'll stay below. Mercer's going to use the ventilation shaft. We've been working on the grate, using spoons filed to points, scraping at the welds. It's taking days, but we're making progress. Once we're through, someone climbs up, gets out, finds American forces. Or tries to. The Soviets might be watching, probably are watching. But Mercer says we're dead if we stay here. Might as well die trying. He can barely hold the spoon with his broken hands, but he's been scraping at that grate for hours every night. I think he blames himself. For all of this, for getting us captured, for not leaving sooner, for trusting the Soviets. He doesn't say it, but I can see it in his face. He's going to get out or kill himself trying. The next entry was dated June 12, 1945. The last entry in the journal. The handwriting was barely legible, scratched across the page like Brennan had been shaking. 12th of June, 1945. They came back. We were working on the shaft when we heard vehicles above. Soviet trucks, heavy equipment. Mercer told us to get down, stay quiet, but they weren't interested in us. They were bringing more prisoners. We heard them, German voices, begging, pleading. And then gunfire. Methodical, one shot at a time, over and over. Must have been 50 people, maybe more. Execution by firing squad, except there was no squad, just one shooter, taking his time. It lasted an hour. When it was over, we heard the bulldozer, burying them, right above us, burying German prisoners in a mass grave in the middle of nowhere. Mercer put his hand over Kozlowski's mouth. Kozlowski was trying to scream. We all wanted to scream. But we stayed quiet. Because the Soviets don't know we're here anymore. They've forgotten about us. Or they think we're already dead. Either way, we have a chance now. A slim chance. Mercer says we go tonight. The shaft is almost open. We get out. We move fast. We head west. We find Americans, or we die trying. I'm writing this in case we don't make it. In case someone finds this bunker years from now and wants to know what happened. We're American soldiers. 28th Infantry Division. We didn't desert. We didn't abandon our duty. We got captured and we survived, and we tried to get home. But our own allies buried us. Tell our families we tried. Tell them we didn't give up. Corporal James Brennan, signing off. That was it. No more entries. Dylan turned the remaining pages, but they were blank. He sat there for a long time, staring at that last line. Tell our families we tried. His grandmother had died believing her husband was killed in action in Germany, died believing he'd fought bravely and fallen honorably. The telegram from the War Department had said as much. Staff Sergeant Robert Mercer, killed in action, 23rd April 1945, during operations in Germany. The nation honors his sacrifice. Except Robert Mercer hadn't died in April. He'd survived. He'd been captured, imprisoned, tortured by Allies, sealed underground, and left to starve. And on June 12, 1945, he'd tried to escape. Dylan didn't know if his grandfather had made it out of that shaft, didn't know if he'd died climbing, died running, or died somewhere in the Kentucky wilderness after Soviet bullets found him. But he knew one thing for certain. The Army had lied. The War Department had lied. Someone in command had decided that 18 American soldiers were expendable, that whatever they'd witnessed was too dangerous to acknowledge, and that their families deserved nothing but a telegram full of noble lies. His phone buzzed. Vance this time. He answered. Mercer, where the hell are you? Home. Sick. Bullshit. Get to base. Now. The Criminal Investigation Command is here. Dylan's chest went tight. CID? They're taking over the bunker site. Want to interview everyone who went inside yesterday. That includes you. She paused. They're also asking about missing evidence. A journal. Someone saw you carrying something when you came out. Dylan looked at Brennan's journal on the table. Evidence of war crimes, evidence of a conspiracy, evidence that would destroy careers, ruin reputations, maybe start an international incident even 50 years later. I don't know anything about a journal, he said. Dylan. Vance's voice went quiet. Don't do this. Whatever you found, turn it over. Don't throw your career away." "I'll be there in an hour." He hung up, stood there in his kitchen, weighing options. He could turn over the journal, let CID handle it, trust the system. The same system that had buried 18 soldiers and lied to their families for 50 years. Or he could finish what Brennan had started. Find out the whole truth. Learn what happened after that last entry. Discover whether any of them made it out, made it home, made it to safety. Find out what happened to his grandfather. Dylan made coffee. Photographed every page of the journal with his phone, uploaded them to a cloud server. Then he wrapped the journal back in its oilcloth, put it in a plastic bag, and buried it in his backyard under the oak tree. Evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, probably a dozen other charges. He didn't care. At 1100 hours, he drove to Fort Campbell and prepared to lie to the Criminal Investigation Command. The CID interview room was deliberately uncomfortable. Gray walls, metal table, chairs bolted to the floor. Special Agent Monica Richardson sat across from Dylan with a recorder running and a file folder that looked too thin for the questions she was about to ask. "Lieutenant Mercer, walk me through yesterday. What you found, what you touched, what you removed from the site." Dylan had rehearsed this on the drive over. Keep it simple. Stick to observable facts. Don't elaborate. "I entered the bunker after the collapse, found evidence of American soldiers, dog tags, personal effects, the remains of what looked like a long-term imprisonment." "Did you remove anything?" "No." Richardson's expression didn't change. "We have a witness who says you were carrying something when you exited, a book or notebook." "I was carrying my field notebook, standard issue. I was taking notes on the structural integrity." "Can I see that notebook?" "It's in my office. I can retrieve it after we're done here." Richardson leaned back. She was mid-40s, competent, the kind of investigator who'd spent 20 years learning when people were lying. Dylan kept his face neutral. "You understand the sensitivity of this discovery," she said. 18 American soldiers deceased in an undocumented structure on U.S. military property. This is a potential war crime. Evidence needs to be preserved, chain of custody maintained. If you removed anything from that site, now's the time to say so." "I didn't remove anything." They stared at each other. Richardson finally nodded, made a note in her file. "All right, tell me what you observed inside." Dylan spent the next hour describing the bunker, the layout, the personal effects, the marks on the walls. He didn't mention Brennan's journal or what it contained. Didn't mention Soviet involvement or executions or broken fingers. Just stuck to what CID would find when they processed the site themselves. When Richardson finally let him go, Dylan walked straight to base archives. The Army kept records on everything: personnel files, unit histories, casualty reports. If his grandfather's unit had been listed as KIA in April 1945, there would be documentation, orders, after-action reports, witness statements, something that explained how 18 men disappeared and why the Army had declared them dead. The archives occupied a climate-controlled building near base headquarters. Staff Sergeant Carol Winters ran the place, a black woman in her 50s who'd been managing Army paperwork since before Dylan was born. "Need to pull some records," Dylan said. "World War II era, 28th Infantry Division." Winters looked at him over her reading glasses. "This about the bunker?" Word traveled fast. "Yes?" "CID was already here. Pulled everything related to the casualty reports from April 1945. She paused. "Sealed it all. Investigation in progress." Dylan's jaw tightened. "There's got to be other records. Unit histories, personnel files, operational reports." "Those aren't sealed. Yet." Winters stood up. "What specifically are you looking for?" "Staff Sergeant Robert Mercer. Killed in action, supposedly April 23, 1945. I need his casualty report, the witness statements, anything that documents how he died." Winters disappeared into the stacks. Dylan waited, watching dust drift through sunlight, wondering how many secrets were filed away in buildings like this. How many lies preserved on acid-free paper, organized by date and catalog number, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to find the truth. Winters came back with a box. Personnel file for Robert Mercer, casualty documentation, unit history for Company B, 28th Infantry. She set it on the table. You've got 2 hours before I have to lock up. Dylan opened the personnel file first. His grandfather stared up at him from a black and white photograph. Young, serious, wearing the uniform with careful pride. Born 1917, Pittsburgh. Enlisted 1942. Carpenter before the war. Promoted to Staff Sergeant, March 1945. The casualty report was 1 page. Typed, official, stamped with War Department seals. Staff Sergeant Robert Mercer, serial number 3318-5479, Company B, 28th Infantry Division, killed in action 23 April 1945 during patrol operations in the vicinity of Weimar, Germany. Remains not recovered due to tactical situation. Next of kin notified 3rd of May, 1945. Remains not recovered. That was the phrase they used when bodies were lost, destroyed, unidentifiable. It explained why there'd been no funeral, no grave, nothing for his grandmother to visit except a name on a memorial wall. Except it was a lie. The remains had been recovered. They'd been sealed in a bunker and hidden for 50 years. Dylan pulled the unit history. Company B had been part of the final push into Germany, advancing through Thuringia in April 1945. The history documented every major engagement, every casualty, every decoration. On April 21, 1945, the company had been ordered to conduct reconnaissance in force near the town of Bad Berka, probing for German defensive positions. 18 men hadn't returned from that patrol. The after-action report was clinical. Patrol encountered enemy resistance, sustained casualties, achieved mission objectives. Enemy forces withdrew during the night. Patrol personnel listed as killed in action, presumed buried by enemy prior to withdrawal. Presumed buried, presumed dead. No bodies recovered, no witnesses, just an assumption that made the paperwork easier. Dylan found the patrol roster, 18 names, his grandfather's at the top, and next to each name, the same notation, KIA, remains not recovered. He photographed everything with his phone, the casualty reports, the roster, the after-action report. Then he kept digging. The box contained letters, official correspondence between Company B's commander and higher headquarters discussing the lost patrol. Dylan read through them, looking for anything that didn't fit the official narrative. He found it in a letter dated May 15, 1945, week after Germany surrendered. From a Captain Theodore Walsh, Eddie Walsh's father, Dylan realized, to the War Department. Sirs, I am writing to request clarification regarding my son, Private Edward J. Walsh, reported killed in action 23 April, 1945. I have received information from another family member of the patrol that there may be confusion about the circumstances of the casualties. I am requesting any additional information available about my son's death and the disposition of his remains. The response, dated June 2, 1945, was brief. Dear Captain Walsh, the War Department confirms that your son, Private Edward J. Walsh, was killed in action during combat operations in Germany. Due to the tactical situation at the time, remains could not be recovered. The department extends its deepest sympathies for your loss. No further information is available. No further information is available. The bureaucratic wall. Dylan kept reading. Captain Walsh had written again. And again. 5 letters over the next 3 months, each one more desperate, each one asking the same questions. Why were there no witness statements? Why had no one from the patrol survived to describe what happened? Why was the War Department refusing to provide details? The final letter was dated September 1945. Sirs, I have now written 5 times requesting information about my son's death. I am a career officer with 20 years of service. I have connections throughout the Army. I know how casualty investigations work. I know when something is being hidden. I am formally requesting a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding the patrol of 21st April 1945 and the deaths of 18 men from Company B, 28th Infantry Division. I have reason to believe these men may not have died as reported. If I do not receive a satisfactory response, I will take this matter to Congress. The response came from a colonel in the War Department. Different tone. No sympathy. Just facts. Captain Walsh, your requests have been reviewed. The circumstances surrounding your son's death are documented and confirmed. The patrol was ambushed, sustained casualties, and the tactical situation prevented recovery of remains. This is a tragic but common occurrence in combat operations. Further inquiries into this matter will be considered insubordinate and potentially harmful to Army morale during the demobilization period. The matter is closed. Any further correspondence regarding this issue will result in disciplinary action. They'd threatened him. An officer asking questions about his own son's death, and the War Department had threatened him into silence. Dylan photographed the letters, kept digging, found similar correspondence from 2 other families, both shut down with the same bureaucratic wall, the same subtle threats. Then he found something that made his blood go cold. A memorandum dated July 15th, 1945. Classified secret, though someone had stamped it declassified in 1995, just 3 months ago, right after the Cold War documents started opening up. From the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, precursor to the CIA, to the War Department. Subject: Soviet liaison complications. Eastern Germany reference is made to 18 personnel from the 28th Infantry Division reported missing 21st April 1945. Per agreement with Soviet Military Command, these personnel are considered casualties of war. No further action required. All inquiries to be directed to OSS for coordination. Classification: secret. Destroy after reading. Someone hadn't destroyed it. Someone had filed it away, classified it, and let it sit in a box for 50 years waiting for declassification. Dylan read it 3 more times. Per agreement with Soviet Military Command. They'd made a deal. The OSS and the Soviets had agreed that 18 American soldiers would be declared dead, and the War Department had gone along with it. His hands were shaking when he photographed the memo. Find what you needed? Winters had appeared in the doorway. Dylan closed the box. Yeah, thanks. Word of advice, Lieutenant. Winters leaned against the doorframe. Whatever you're looking into, be careful. CID doesn't just investigate crimes. They investigate investigators. And they don't like it when people dig into things that were buried for a reason. I'm just doing research. Sure you are. She smiled, but her eyes were serious. My grandfather was 92nd Infantry, Buffalo Soldiers, Italy. He used to say the Army has 2 histories, the one they write down and the one they bury. Said the buried one's always uglier, but it's the one that matters. Dylan stood up. Your grandfather sounds like a smart man. He was. He also knew when to stop digging before the hole collapsed on him. She took the box. 2 hours, Lieutenant. That's all I can give you. Dylan left the archives with his phone full of evidence and his head full of questions. The official story was clear. 18 men died in combat, remains not recovered. But the classified memo told a different story. The OSS and the Soviets had made an agreement, and 18 soldiers had been sacrificed to keep it. He needed to know why, needed to know what those men had witnessed that was worth burying them alive. And he needed help. Someone who could translate the Soviet documents that would be in that bunker. Someone who understood the politics of 1945, the tensions between allies, the reasons why the truth might have been too dangerous to acknowledge. Dr. Helen Kovac. Vance had mentioned her yesterday, military historian, Eastern European specialist, consulting on the bunker investigation. Dylan headed for the University of Tennessee campus in Nashville. If anyone could help him understand what his grandfather had witnessed, it was her. And if she wouldn't help, he'd do it alone. Either way, the truth was coming out. Dr. Helen Kovac's office was buried in the history department, 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old books and burnt coffee. Dylan found her door at the end of a hallway lined with faculty mailboxes and faded posters about symposiums from 3 years ago. He knocked. A voice called out in what sounded like Czech, then switched to English. "It's open." Kovacs was in her mid-50s, gray hair pulled back, reading glasses perched on her nose. Her office was chaos, books stacked on every surface, maps pinned to walls, file boxes labeled in multiple languages. She looked up from a document covered in Cyrillic text. "Lieutenant Mercer, I was wondering when you'd show up." Dylan closed the door behind him. "You know who I am?" "Major Vance called. Said you might come looking for help." She set down her pen. "Said you were asking questions about the bunker, about the soldiers. Said you seemed personally invested." "My grandfather was one of them." Kovacs' expression shifted. Something like sympathy, but harder. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Not yet." Dylan pulled out his phone. "I need your help understanding something." He showed her the photographs, the journal entries about Soviet executions, the OSS memo about an agreement, the letters from families shut down by the War Department. Kovacs scrolled through them in silence, her face getting darker with each image. When she finished, she set the phone down and removed her glasses. "Where did you get these?" "The journal was in the bunker. The documents were in base archives, declassified 3 months ago." "Does CID know you have this?" "No." Kovacs stood up, went to her office door, locked it. Then she pulled down the shade on the window. When she turned back, her expression was grim. "You're playing with fire, Lieutenant. This isn't just a war crime. This is Cold War politics, intelligence operations, diplomatic agreements. People killed to keep secrets like this buried." "My grandfather was buried alive. I'm not worried about political sensitivities." "You should be." Kovacs sat back down. "But since you're here, I'll tell you what I know, and what I suspect." She pulled out a map of Eastern Europe, circa 1945, spread it across her desk, pointing to the region where Dylan's grandfather had disappeared. Thuringia. This whole area was supposed to go to the Soviets under the Yalta Agreement, but in April 1945, American forces got there first. Eisenhower pulled them back deliberately, let the Soviets take over according to the plan. It was supposed to show good faith, Allied cooperation. But something went wrong. A lot of things went wrong. Kovacs' finger traced the Soviet advance. The Red Army wasn't just fighting Germans at this point. They were settling scores. What your grandfather witnessed, Soviet forces executing German prisoners, that happened all over Eastern Europe in the spring of 1945. Revenge for what Germany did to Russia. Millions dead, entire cities destroyed. The Soviets wanted blood. Dylan thought about Brennan's journal, the methodical gunfire, the bulldozer. The Americans knew about this? Some did. Command level, intelligence services. They knew the Soviets were executing prisoners, looting, raping their way across Germany. But officially, the Soviets were our allies. We needed them to finish Japan, couldn't afford a diplomatic crisis. Kovacs leaned back. So when American soldiers witnessed war crimes, when they became inconvenient witnesses to Soviet brutality, someone made a decision. To bury them. To make them disappear, yes, clean, simple, deniable. List them as combat casualties. Seal the evidence. Move on. She gestured at Dylan's phone. That OSS memo confirms it. They made a deal with Soviet command. Your grandfather's unit became political casualties. Dylan felt something cold settle in his chest. How many others? What? The hook to this story mentions 1,000 soldiers. How many other units were buried like this? Kovacs was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled a file from one of her boxes. I've been researching this for 10 years. Soviet-American relations in the final months of the war. There are inconsistencies, units that disappeared, casualty reports that don't match operational records, families asking questions that never got answered. She spread documents across the desk, personnel rosters, casualty lists, maps with red circles marking disappearances. I've identified 17 separate incidents, different units, different locations, all in Soviet-occupied territory between April and June 1945. Total of 943 American soldiers listed as killed in action, remains not recovered. She looked up. None of those remains were ever found. No mass graves, no battlefield burials, nothing. They just vanished. Dylan stared at the documents. Nearly 1,000 men, not just his grandfather's unit, a systematic pattern of disappearances, covered up, classified, buried in paperwork for 50 years. Why haven't you published this? Because I can't prove it. Kovach's voice was frustrated. I have circumstantial evidence, patterns, inconsistencies, but no smoking gun, no direct evidence that these men were deliberately silenced. Until now. She gestured at his phone. That journal, those OSS memos, that's the proof I needed. That's the story that changes everything. So we publish it. It's not that simple. Kovach stood up, started pacing. You have to understand the politics. The Cold War just ended 4 years ago. Russia's trying to join NATO, become part of the international community. If this comes out now, evidence that the Soviet Union murdered American POWs with OSS approval, it destroys that process, makes Russia look like the enemy again, makes America look complicit in war crimes. Good, we were complicit. Yes, but people in power don't want that acknowledged. Not now, not when we're trying to build a new world order. She stopped pacing. If you go public with this, Lieutenant, you'll be fighting the entire defense and intelligence establishment. They'll destroy you. They'll discredit the evidence, attack your credibility, bury this story so deep it never sees daylight again. Dylan thought about his grandmother, about the telegram that had lied to her face, about 18 men who'd survived a war only to be sacrificed for politics. I don't care, Kovach smiled, but it was sad. I believe you. But you need more than moral outrage. You need irrefutable proof. You need Soviet documents, witness testimony, physical evidence that can't be dismissed. That journal is a start, but it's one man's account. CID will claim it's fake, manufactured, unreliable. What do I need? Kovach sat back down. Soviet military records, the orders for the executions your grandfather witnessed, documentation of the agreement with the OSS, and ideally a survivor. Someone who can testify that they were there, that this happened, that the story is true. Brennan's journal says they tried to escape, June 12, 1945. If any of them made it out, then they've been hiding for 50 years. The OSS would have hunted them. Can't have witnesses walking around telling stories about Soviet war crimes and American complicity. Kovach pulled out another document. But it's possible. 1 or 2 might have survived, might have gone underground, changed identities. She slid the document across the desk. A list of names. Dylan recognized some from the bunker. Brennan, Walsh, Russo. His grandfather's name was there. This is everyone from the patrol? Everyone listed as killed in action, but look at the dates. Kovach pointed. Most are listed as KIA on April 23, 1945, but 3 have different dates, June 15th, July 2nd, August 11th, all after the war ended. Dylan's heart started pounding. Why would they update casualty dates months later? Because someone was still alive. Someone made it out of that bunker, survived long enough to become a problem. And the Army had to officially kill them to make the story work. She pulled out another document, a classified report stamped with 1995 declassification. This is from Army Counterintelligence, August 1945. They were tracking 3 soldiers, Corporal James Brennan, Private Anthony Russo, Staff Sergeant Robert Mercer, all reported as deserters after escaping Soviet custody. The report says they were considered security risks, potentially compromised by enemy contact, to be detained for debriefing if located. Dylan's hands shook as he took the document. His grandfather had escaped, had survived, had been hunted by his own army. Where did they go? The trail goes cold in August 1945. The counterintelligence file closes with a notation, subjects deceased, case closed. But there's no death certificates, no burial records, nothing concrete. Just a notation in a classified file. Kovach leaned forward. Lieutenant, I think some of those men survived. I think they went underground, hid, maybe lived out their lives under false names. They couldn't come home. The OSS would have silenced them, but they might have survived. How do we find them? We don't. They've had 50 years to disappear, but... She pulled out a newspaper clipping, dated 1992. Obituary section. Anthony Russo died in Portland, Oregon, 1992. Survived by a daughter, 2 grandchildren. The obituary says he was a carpenter, never served in the military, lived a quiet life. Dylan stared at the name. Private First Class Anthony Russo, the medic from the bunker, supposedly killed in action in 1945. You think this is him? The age matches. The location. Portland was a good place to disappear in the 40s. West Coast, lots of new arrivals after the war, easy to get lost. And look at this. She pointed to a detail in the obituary. It says he was a skilled woodworker, made furniture by hand. Your grandfather was a carpenter before the war. What are the odds? You think they stayed together? I think some of them might have. Brothers in arms, shared trauma, mutual protection. If I survived what they survived, I wouldn't trust anyone except the men who were there with me. Kovacs looked at Dylan. Russo had a daughter. She'd be in her 50s now. If her father told her anything before he died, if there's any documentation, letters, proof, she'd have it. Maybe, or maybe she knows nothing. Maybe Russo took his secrets to the grave. Kovacs shrugged. But it's the best lead we have. Dylan stood up. His mind was racing, fitting pieces together. His grandfather had escaped, had survived, at least for a while. Might have made it to Portland, might have lived under a false name, might have died never being able to tell his family the truth. I need to get to Portland. You need to be careful, Kovacs said. CID is watching you. If they find out you're investigating this independently, they'll shut you down, and they won't be polite about it. Then I'll take leave. Personal time, just a lieutenant visiting the West Coast. Nothing suspicious. Kovacs smiled. You're going to do this regardless of what I say, aren't you? Yes? Then take this. She handed him a business card. My contact information. If you find anything, if you get in trouble, call me. I have friends in journalism, in academia, people who can help get this story out if the Army tries to bury it again. Dylan pocketed the card, started for the door. Lieutenant? Kovacs' voice stopped him. Your grandfather, if he survived, if he lived under another name, he did it to stay alive. The OSS would have killed him if they'd found him. Remember that. Whatever you discover, whatever happened to him, he did what he had to do. Dylan nodded, left her office with his phone full of evidence and a destination in mind. Portland, Oregon. Anthony Russo's daughter. A chance that somewhere in her father's possessions there was proof that would force the Army to acknowledge the truth. That 18 men hadn't died in combat, that they'd been murdered by politics, and that some of them had survived long enough to become ghosts. Dylan requested 7 days of personal leave. His company commander signed off without questions. Everyone assumed he needed time after the bunker discovery, after finding evidence of his grandfather's death. They had no idea he was planning to hunt for evidence that his grandfather had survived. He flew to Portland on a Thursday morning, spent the flight reading through Brennan's journal entries on his phone, memorizing details, looking for anything that might help identify the men who'd escaped. By the time the plane touched down, he had 3 names burned into his memory: Brennan, Russo, and Robert Mercer. The Portland Public Library had archives going back to the 1940s. Dylan started with city directories looking for Anthony Russo. Found him in the 1947 edition, carpenter living on Southeast Morrison Street. Same address through 1992 when the trail ended with that obituary. Russo's daughter was listed in the white pages. Margaret Russo Chen, still in Portland, still at an address 10 minutes from where her father had lived. Dylan sat in the library, staring at the phone number, wondering what he was going to say. Hi, I think your father was a soldier who faked his death and lived under a false identity for 50 years. Can we talk? He called anyway. A woman answered on the 3rd ring. Hello. Ms. Russo Chen, my name is Dylan Mercer. I'm calling about your father, Anthony Russo. Silence. Then, who is this? I'm an Army lieutenant. I'm researching soldiers from World War II. I have reason to believe your father may have served. My father didn't serve. He was a carpenter, civilian. Her voice was tight, defensive. Whatever you're looking for, you have the wrong person. Ma'am, please, I just need 5 minutes of your time. I can come to you, or we can meet somewhere public. It's important. My father's been dead 3 years. Whatever questions you have, they died with him. She hung up. Dylan sat there, listening to the dial tone, and thought about what Kovac had said. If he survived, he did it to stay alive. Russo had spent 50 years hiding, keeping his secret, protecting himself from people asking questions. Of course, his daughter would be defensive. He drove to the address anyway. The house was small, well-maintained, on a quiet street with old trees and neat lawns. Dylan parked across the street and waited. 20 minutes later, a woman came out, 50s, Asian features, carrying grocery bags. Margaret Russo Chen. She stopped when she saw him getting out of his car. I told you on the phone, my father didn't serve. I know that's what he told you. Dylan pulled out his phone, showed her the photo of the patrol roster. But this is a list of soldiers from the 28th Infantry Division who disappeared in April 1945. Private First Class Anthony Russo. Age, hometown, enlistment date. Everything matches your father. Margaret stared at the screen. Her hands tightened on the grocery bags. That's not possible. Your father was a medic. He survived a German prison camp, escaped Soviet custody, and came to Portland to disappear. Dylan lowered his phone. One of the other men on that patrol was my grandfather. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to know what happened to them. Margaret's face had gone pale. Get off my property. Your father kept records. I know he did. Soldiers like him, men who survived that kind of trauma, they document everything. It's how they process, how they cope. He kept something, didn't he? Letters, journals, photographs? I said, get off my property. But her voice cracked, and Dylan saw it in her eyes. Recognition, fear, the knowledge that what he was saying was true. Please. My grandmother died believing her husband was killed in action. She never knew he survived, never knew he was murdered by the people he trusted. Your father knew the truth. He lived with it for 50 years. Don't let that truth die with him. Margaret stood there, grocery bags cutting into her hands. Dylan could see her processing, deciding, weighing risks. Finally, she said, inside, 5 minutes. Then you leave. The house smelled like woodwork and old paper. Margaret set down her groceries and led Dylan to a den at the back of the house. Furniture her father had made, a desk, shelves, a rocking chair with joints so precise they looked machine-made. My father died of cancer, Margaret said. The last few weeks he was on morphine, hallucinating. He kept talking about people who weren't there, soldiers, Germans, Russians. I thought it was the drugs. She pulled a box from a closet. After he died, I found this, hidden in his workshop, behind a false panel. She opened the box. Inside were dog tags, 3 sets, corroded and worn. Letters tied with string, addresses written in faded ink, photographs of young men in uniform, and a leather journal, similar to Brennan's, filled with dense handwriting. He never talked about the war, not once in 50 years. I asked when I was a kid, and he'd just say he was too young to serve, had a medical deferment. But these, she touched the dog tags. These were his, the real ones. Dylan's hands shook as he picked up the journal. The handwriting was different from Brennan's, smaller, more cramped, like someone writing in the dark to conserve space. June 13th, 1945. We made it out. 3 of us. Brennan died in the shaft. The climb was too much. His body gave out. Mercer and I got to the surface. The Soviets saw us. We ran. Dylan flipped through pages. Russo's account of the escape, running through German forests at night, hiding during the day. Soviet patrols hunting them, making it to American lines, only to be detained by counterintelligence instead of welcomed home. July 1945. They're holding us at a facility outside Frankfurt. Not a hospital, not a POW camp, something else. They keep asking what we saw, what we know, what we'll say if we're released. Mercer told them everything, the executions, the cover-up, the OSS deal. They didn't write any of it down, just listened. Then they separated us. I haven't seen Mercer in 2 weeks. They won't tell me where he is." Dylan's throat went tight. His grandfather had made it to American custody, had survived the escape, the run through enemy territory, the whole nightmare, and the Army had detained him anyway. August 3rd, 1945. A major from the OSS visited today, asked if I wanted to go home, said I could if I signed papers agreeing never to discuss Soviet operations, never to mention what happened to our unit. Said if I agreed, they'd give me a new identity, help me start over somewhere far from Pennsylvania. Said if I didn't agree, I'd stay here indefinitely. Maybe face charges for desertion, maybe just disappear into the system. I asked about Mercer. The major smiled, said Mercer was stubborn, said Mercer wouldn't take the deal, said some men don't know when to let things go. I signed the papers. Dylan had to stop reading, had to look away from the page, blink away the burning in his eyes. His grandfather had refused the deal, had refused to stay silent, refused to pretend, refused to let the truth die. And the OSS had made him disappear for it. "Keep reading," Margaret said quietly. She'd been watching him, her face full of something like understanding. Dylan forced himself to continue. August 15th, 1945. They gave me a new name, new papers, birth certificate, Social Security card. Anthony Russo is officially dead, killed in action in Germany. I'm Thomas Chen now. Chinese-American, born in California, never served in the military. They even gave me a job reference, a work history, everything I need to build a new life. They're sending me to Portland, West Coast, far from home, far from anyone who might recognize me. They said other survivors are being sent to different cities, said we'll never see each other again, said that's for our own protection. I asked about Mercer one more time. The major's smile went away. Said Mercer had an accident, training incident, killed instantly, said these things happen. I knew he was lying. I knew they killed him. The journal entries after that were sporadic. Russo, Thomas Chen, documenting his new life in Portland. Working as a carpenter, staying quiet, never drawing attention. Meeting a woman in 1950, getting married in 1951, having a daughter in 1953. Building a normal life on top of a lie. But every few years, he'd write something else. Memories of the bunker, nightmares about the executions, wondering what happened to the other survivors, if any of them were still alive, if any of them had tried to tell the truth. The final entry was dated March 1992, 2 months before he died. Margaret asked me today why I never talk about my childhood. She's 40 now, old enough to know the truth, but I can't tell her, can't burden her with this. The OSS is probably long gone, the Cold War's over, maybe no one cares anymore. But I made a promise, signed papers, agreed to stay silent. Mercer didn't make that promise. Mercer died for telling the truth. The least I can do is honor his sacrifice by keeping mine. If anyone ever finds this, tell the families we tried. Tell them we didn't give up. Tell them some of us survived, even if we couldn't come home. Tell them the truth. Dylan closed the journal, sat there in silence while Margaret watched him. "Your grandfather," she said. "He was the one who wouldn't take the deal?" "Yeah." "What happened to him?" Dylan looked at the dog tags in the box. 3 sets, Brennan's, Russo's, and one other. He picked up the 3rd set. Mercer, Robert 3, 318, 5479, B. Poss Methodist. "I don't know yet," Dylan said. "But I'm going to find out." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Take the journal, take the letters. My father wanted this story told. He was just too afraid to tell it himself." Dylan loaded everything into his backpack, the journal, the letters, the photographs, the dog tags. Evidence of a conspiracy, evidence of survival, evidence that the truth had been buried but never quite destroyed. "There's one more thing," Margaret said. She went to her father's desk, pulled out a letter. "This came in 1972. My father opened it, read it once, then hid it. I found it with the journal." Dylan unfolded the letter. The handwriting was shaky but readable. "Tony, don't know if you're still in Portland. still alive, still using the name they gave you. Don't know if this will reach you, or if someone at the OSS is still reading mail, looking for ghosts. But I had to try. I'm in Montana. Different name, different life. Got a family now, kids who don't know their father's a dead man. Been thinking about what happened, about the deal we took, about Mercer. He was right. We should have told the truth. Should have gone public, made them acknowledge what they did. But we were scared. We wanted to live. I'm writing this because I'm dying. Cancer. Doctors give me 6 months, and I can't die without someone knowing, without someone remembering that we existed, that it happened, that Mercer didn't die for nothing. If you get this, if you're still out there, find someone. Tell them. Don't let this story die with us. Jimmy Brennan Dylan stared at the signature. Brennan had survived, too. Had made it out, taken the deal, lived in Montana under a false name until cancer killed him. Do you know where he went? Dylan asked. What name he used? Margaret shook her head. My father never wrote back. Too afraid, I think. Afraid the OSS would track the letter, find them both, finish what they started. Dylan folded the letter carefully. Brennan in Montana, Russo in Portland, both of them living false lives, dying with secrets they couldn't share. And his grandfather, the one who'd refused the deal, refused to stay silent, killed for his defiance. Thank you, Dylan said, for showing me this, for trusting me. Make it count, Margaret said. My father lived 50 years as a ghost. Don't let that be for nothing. Dylan left Portland with evidence that would blow the cover-up wide open. Journals from 2 survivors, letters proving the OSS had silenced witnesses, documentation that American soldiers had been murdered by their own government for knowing too much. But he still didn't know what happened to his grandfather after August 1945. Didn't know where they'd taken him, how they'd killed him, where he was buried. That answer was waiting back in Kentucky in classified files that CID was trying to keep sealed. Dylan was going to break them open. Dylan flew back to Kentucky on Sunday night. By Monday morning, CID had issued a warrant for his questioning. Major Vance called while he was driving to base. Where the hell have you been? Personal leave. Portland. Portland? Her voice went flat. Richardson wants to know if you visited anyone connected to the bunker investigation. I visited a friend. Had some thinking to do. Dylan, they know. I don't know how, but they know you're digging into this. Richardson's building a case for obstruction, evidence tampering, maybe even espionage, depending on what classified materials you've accessed. She paused. Turn over whatever you found. Take the reprimand. Walk away before this destroys your career. Can't do that, ma'am. Then God help you. She hung up. Dylan kept driving. He'd expected this, the Army closing ranks, protecting its secrets, trying to bury him the same way they'd buried his grandfather. But he had insurance now. Journals, letters, photographs, all backed up to 3 different cloud servers and shared with Kovac. If CID arrested him, if he disappeared, the story would still get out. He drove straight to the legal office on base. Captain Jennifer Wade, JAG Corps, mid-30s, and sharp enough to make colonel someday. Dylan had worked with her on a contract dispute last year. She was fair, thorough, and didn't tolerate bullshit from anyone. I need legal representation, he said. Wade looked up from her desk. For what? CID's going to charge me with obstruction, evidence tampering, unauthorized disclosure of classified information, and probably a dozen other things. I need someone who will fight them instead of rolling over. Wade leaned back in her chair. Tell me what you did. Dylan told her everything. The bunker, the journal, the archives, Portland, Russo's daughter, the evidence he'd collected. Wade listened without interrupting, her expression getting darker with each detail. When he finished, she said, You're screwed. I know. No, I mean legally, procedurally, career-wise, you're completely screwed. You removed evidence from a crime scene. You accessed classified materials without clearance. You traveled across state lines conducting an unauthorized investigation. CID has you dead to rights on at least 6 charges. Can you defend me? I can try, but Dylan, The best defense in the world won't matter if the Army wants you gone badly enough. They'll court-martial you, strip your commission, maybe put you in Leavenworth. She pulled out a legal pad. Why are you doing this? Why throw your career away over something that happened 50 years ago? Because they murdered my grandfather and 1,000 other soldiers, and they've been lying about it for half a century. Dylan pulled out his phone, showed her Brennan's journal entries. Read that. Tell me I should walk away. Wade read in silence. When she finished, her jaw was tight. Jesus Christ. Yeah. This is real? You can verify all of it? I have 2 survivor journals, OSS memos, casualty reports that don't match operational records, letters from families the War Department silenced. I can prove everything. Wade stood up, started pacing. Okay, here's what's going to happen. CID will arrest you, probably today. They'll charge you, convene a court-martial, and put you in pretrial confinement. Standard procedure for classified information cases. She stopped pacing. But if this evidence is as solid as you say, we can use the trial, make it public, force the Army to acknowledge what happened. They'll try to seal the proceedings, national security. Probably, but we can fight that. First Amendment, public interest, freedom of information. It's a long shot, but it's the only shot you have. Wade sat back down. I'll represent you, pro bono if they pull my assignment. But Dylan, understand what you're risking. You could lose everything. I already lost my grandfather. Everything else is negotiable. Wade nodded. Then let's get to work. First thing, we need to secure that evidence. Multiple copies, multiple locations, shared with journalists and historians who can publish if you're silenced. Can you do that? Already done? Good. Second, we need witness testimony. Russo's daughter, anyone else who can corroborate the story. And we need to find out what happened to your grandfather after August 1945, where they took him, what they did to him, where he's buried. That's in classified files. CID sealed everything. Then we force them to unseal it. Discovery process, subpoena authority, judicial orders. If they want to prosecute you, they have to let us see the evidence they're protecting. Wade smiled, but it was grim. They opened this door. Let's walk through it. Dylan spent the next 4 hours with Wade, building their defense strategy. They documented everything, the timeline of his investigation, the sources of his evidence, the chain of custody for materials he'd collected. Wade called Kovacs, got her formal statement as an expert witness, called Margaret Russo Chen, secured her agreement to testify. By 1500 hours, they had a defense. Not a guarantee, but a fighting chance. CID arrested Dylan at 15:30. Special Agent Richardson and 2 MPs conducting themselves with professional courtesy that couldn't quite hide the satisfaction in Richardson's eyes. They cuffed him in his office, read him his rights, and escorted him across base while soldiers stopped to watch. The confinement facility at Fort Campbell was small, mostly used for pretrial detention. Dylan got a cell 8 feet by 10, concrete walls, a bunk with a thin mattress, and a toilet that smelled like industrial cleaner. The door locked with a sound that felt final. He sat on the bunk and thought about his grandfather. Wondered if Robert Mercer had been in a cell like this in August 1945, detained by counterintelligence, isolated from anyone who might help him. Wondered what his grandfather had thought in those final days, knowing the truth and knowing no one wanted to hear it. Richardson came to see him at 1800 hours. Sat in the plastic chair outside the cell, looking satisfied. You made this harder than it needed to be, Mercer. Just doing my job, investigating a crime. You tampered with evidence, obstructed a federal investigation, disclosed classified information to unauthorized personnel. Richardson pulled out a folder. We've got you on 7 counts. Judge Advocate General has already convened a court-martial. Trial date set for 3 weeks from now. Looking forward to it. Richardson's smile faded. You think this is going to be some dramatic reveal? Some moment where you expose the truth and everyone applauds? It's not. The proceedings will be sealed. Your evidence will be classified, and when it's over, you'll be in Leavenworth for the next 10 years. Maybe, or maybe I'll force the Army to admit what it did. Either way, the truth gets out. No, it doesn't. Richardson leaned forward. We've been burying stories like this for 70 years. You think you're the first person to discover uncomfortable truths about the war? You're not, and you won't be the last. But the system's designed to handle people like you, to contain the damage, protect the institution, and ensure that certain secrets stay secret. Not this time. Every time. Richardson stood up. You had a chance to walk away, to have a career, a life, a future. Now you have nothing. She left. The door locked behind her. Dylan lay on the bunk, staring at the ceiling, and thought about the journals he'd read, about Brennan and Russo taking the deal, living as ghosts, dying with their secrets, about his grandfather refusing to stay silent, paying the price for his defiance. Dylan had made his choice. Same choice his grandfather had made. Some truths were worth destroying yourself to tell. 3 days later, Wade came to see him. She looked exhausted, carrying a briefcase full of documents. Good news and bad news, she said. Good news. The judge denied CID's motion to seal the trial completely. Proceedings will be closed, but the verdict and key evidence will be public record. And the bad news? CID found something. Wade pulled out a document. Classified file, recently declassified. Last week, actually. Convenient timing. It's about your grandfather. Dylan sat up. What does it say? According to this, Robert Mercer was killed on August 11th, 1945. Training accident at a counterintelligence facility in Germany. Accidental discharge of a weapon during a detention interview. Wade's voice was careful. His body was buried at an American military cemetery near Frankfurt. Unmarked grave, classified location, sealed records. Dylan felt something cold settle in his chest. That's the official story. That's the only story CID is willing to acknowledge. They're using it to argue that your grandfather did die in 1945, that his death is documented and verified, and that your entire investigation is based on conspiracy theories and circumstantial evidence. But Russo's journal says your grandfather was detained, doesn't say he died. CID's arguing that Russo didn't know what happened after they were separated, that he assumed the worst, that his journal is based on speculation rather than direct knowledge. Dylan stood up, started pacing the small cell. It's a cover-up. They killed him and called it an accident, same way they killed the others. Training incident, accidental discharge, it's their standard excuse. I know, but proving it requires evidence we don't have. We need the original autopsy report, witness statements from personnel at the facility, something that contradicts the official story. Wade leaned against the wall. And CID has sealed all of that, classified for national security reasons. Then we force them to unseal it. Discovery process. If they're using that file to defend themselves, we have the right to examine the underlying evidence. Already filed the motion. Judge will rule next week. Wade looked at him. But Dylan, even if we get access, even if we prove your grandfather was murdered, that doesn't help your case. You're still guilty of the charges they filed. The best we can hope for is using the trial to expose what happened, make it public enough that the story survives, even if you don't. Then that's what we do. Wade nodded, pulled out another document. One more thing. We got a response to our witness list. CID is calling their own expert, a Colonel Frank Dietrich, Army Intelligence. He's going to testify about Soviet-American relations in 1945, argue that any agreement between the OSS and Soviet command was necessary for national security, that the soldiers who witnessed war crimes had to be contained to prevent a diplomatic crisis. Who is he? 30-year veteran intelligence, specialist, multiple classified assignments. He was a lieutenant in 1945, assigned to counterintelligence in Germany. Wade met his eyes. He was there, Dylan, when your grandfather was detained, when the OSS made their deals. He knows exactly what happened. Then we break him on the stand, make him admit the truth. Or he destroys our case. He's credible, experienced, and backed by the entire defense establishment. Wade closed her briefcase. Trial's in 2 weeks. Use that time to prepare. Read everything, memorize everything, be ready to testify without notes. This is going to be the fight of your life." She left. Dylan sat alone in his cell, thinking about Colonel Dietrich, a man who'd been there in 1945, who'd seen the conspiracy unfold, who'd spent 50 years protecting the secret, a man who'd been part of silencing witnesses, a man who might know exactly where Robert Mercer was buried. Dylan had 2 weeks to prepare, 2 weeks to build a case that could force the truth into the light, 2 weeks to finish what his grandfather had started. The court-martial convened on a gray Thursday morning in November. The courtroom was small, military austere. No windows, fluorescent lights, the seal of the United States Army on the wall behind the judge's bench. Judge Colonel Patricia Morrison presiding, a woman in her 60s with 30 years on the bench and a reputation for following procedure to the letter. Dylan sat at the defense table in his dress uniform, stripped of rank insignia per pretrial order. Wade sat beside him, files stacked neatly, prepared for war. Across the aisle, the prosecution had sent a full team, 3 JAG officers led by Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Marsh, a career prosecutor who'd never lost a classified information case. The gallery was closed to the public, but Kovacs had been granted observer status as an expert witness. Margaret Russo Chen sat in the back row, the only family member present. Dylan's parents had wanted to come, but Wade had advised against it. Better they didn't hear what was about to be said. Morrison called the court to order. The charges were read: obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, unauthorized disclosure of classified information, conduct unbecoming an officer. Dylan pleaded not guilty to all counts. Marsh stood for his opening statement, tall, confident, voice pitched to fill the room without shouting. "Your Honor, this case is straightforward. The defendant removed evidence from a secured crime scene. He accessed classified materials without proper clearance. He conducted an unauthorized investigation and shared classified information with civilian personnel. The evidence is clear, the charges are proven, and the defendant's guilt is beyond question." Marsh gestured toward Dylan. "Lieutenant Mercer may believe his actions were justified. He may believe he was pursuing some greater truth. But the law does not recognize vigilante justice. The regulations do not permit officers to decide which rules they'll follow and which they'll ignore. The defendant broke the law. He must face the consequences." Marsh sat down. Morrison nodded to Wade. Wade stood slowly. She didn't move toward the bench, didn't raise her voice, just spoke clearly, deliberately, every word weighted. "Your Honor, the prosecution is correct that Lieutenant Mercer broke regulations. He did remove evidence. He did access classified files. He did share information with civilian experts." She paused. "But the prosecution has failed to explain why those classified files existed in the first place, why evidence of American soldiers was hidden for 50 years, why families were lied to about how their loved ones died." She pulled out a photograph, the patrol roster, 18 names, held it up for the judge to see. "These men disappeared in April 1945. The Army declared them killed in action. But they weren't killed in action. They were captured by Germans, liberated by Soviets, and then imprisoned by their own command because they witnessed war crimes that were politically inconvenient." Wade set the photo on the evidence table. Lieutenant Mercer didn't break the law to satisfy curiosity. He broke it to expose a conspiracy that has been killing the truth for half a century. Marsh was on his feet. "Objection. Counsel is making arguments not supported by evidence." "Then let's examine the evidence," Wade said. "Let's see what the Army has been hiding." Morrison raised a hand. "Save it for testimony, Captain Wade. Opening statements are for outlining your case, not arguing it." She looked at both attorneys. "I'm going to allow limited testimony regarding the historical context of the bunker discovery. But this trial is about the defendant's actions, not a referendum on Army policy from 1945. Understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," both attorneys said. The prosecution called their first witness, Special Agent Richardson. She testified about the bunker discovery, the evidence found, Dylan's removal of the journal. Straightforward, professional, damaging. Wade's cross-examination barely dented her testimony. Next came Major Vance, testifying about base protocols, chain of custody, Dylan's breach of procedure. Again, Wade couldn't shake the basic facts. Dylan had broken the rules. The question was whether the rules should have applied. Then Marsh called Colonel Frank Dietrich. Dietrich was in his 70s but carried himself like a man 20 years younger. Ramrod straight, uniform immaculate, ribbons covering his chest. Bronze Star, Legion of Merit, 3 decades of classified service awards. He took the stand with the confidence of someone who'd testified at 100 classified hearings. Marsh walked him through his credentials. Intelligence officer, 30 years active duty, assignments in Germany, Eastern Europe, Pentagon Command. Expert in Cold War operations and Soviet-American relations. Colonel Dietrich, were you stationed in Germany in 1945? Yes, sir. Lieutenant at the time, assigned to Counterintelligence Corps. Were you involved in operations related to Soviet liaison activities? I was, part of the team managing repatriation of American personnel from Soviet-controlled territory. Marsh showed him the OSS memo about the 18 soldiers. Colonel, have you seen this document before? Dietrich studied it. I have. It was part of operational files from that period. Can you explain what it refers to? This agreement with Soviet military command? Dietrich's voice was measured, authoritative. In the final months of the war, there were complications. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly, occupying territory faster than we could coordinate. American soldiers sometimes ended up behind Soviet lines. Repatriating them required cooperation with Soviet command. Were there difficulties with that cooperation? At times, the Soviets were suspicious of American personnel in their zone. They worried about espionage, intelligence gathering. Sometimes they detained Americans while verifying their identities. Dietrich looked directly at the judge. Our agreement was that we would provide documentation for our personnel, and they would release them through proper channels. The memo refers to one such agreement. What happened to the 18 soldiers mentioned in this memo? They were repatriated through Soviet channels, returned to American control in July 1945. Several required medical treatment for injuries sustained during captivity. One died of complications from those injuries. Staff Sergeant Robert Mercer, the defendant's grandfather. Dylan's hands clenched under the table. Wade touched his arm, a silent warning to stay calm. Marsh nodded. So the official record is accurate. These men were casualties of war? The official record is accurate, Dietrich said. Tragic casualties, but not unusual given the chaos of war's end. And the journal the defendant claims to have found, the account of Soviet war crimes, OSS cover-ups, how would you characterize that? Objection, Wade said. The witness hasn't examined the journal. I'll rephrase, Marsh said. Colonel, based on your experience, is it possible that soldiers detained by Soviet forces might have misinterpreted what they witnessed? Might have viewed legitimate security operations as something more sinister? It's possible, Dietrich said carefully. Soldiers under extreme stress, malnourished, isolated, they sometimes developed paranoid interpretations of events. The Soviets were harsh, certainly, but we were allies. There was no conspiracy to silence witnesses or cover up crimes. Dylan leaned toward Wade, whispered, "He's lying. He was there. He knows what happened." "I know," Wade whispered back. "Let him finish. Then we tear him apart." Marsh continued for another 20 minutes, building Dietrich's testimony into a wall, every question reinforcing the official narrative, every answer making Dylan look like a conspiracy theorist chasing ghosts. When Marsh finally sat down, Dietrich looked relaxed, confident. Morrison nodded to Wade. Cross-examination. Wade stood, picked up a document from her table, walked toward the witness stand slowly. "Colonel Dietrich, you testified that you were assigned to counterintelligence in Germany in 1945. What were your specific duties?" "Liaison with Allied forces, managing repatriation cases, security screening of personnel returning from enemy custody." "Security screening, that involved interrogations?" "Debriefings, yes." "And if someone being debriefed made allegations about Allied forces, say allegations of war crimes, what would you do with that information?" Dietrich's expression didn't change. "We would document it, investigate as appropriate, and forward it through proper channels. Would you ever suppress that information, classify it to prevent disclosure? If national security required it, yes, that was standard procedure. Wade held up the document. This is a counterintelligence report from August 1945, recently declassified. It lists 3 soldiers as detained for security purposes: Corporal James Brennan, Private Anthony Russo, Staff Sergeant Robert Mercer. Your name is on the authorization. Do you remember these men? Dietrich studied the document. A micro pause, barely visible. I processed hundreds of cases. I don't recall specific names. Let me refresh your memory. Wade pulled out Russo's journal, the pages she'd photocopied. Private Russo kept a journal. He describes being detained at a counterintelligence facility, being interrogated about what his unit witnessed, being offered a deal, stay silent and get a new identity, or refuse and face indefinite detention. She looked at Dietrich. Does that refresh your memory? I don't recall that specific case. You don't recall offering soldiers new identities in exchange for silence? Objection, Marsh said. Counsel is testifying. Sustained. Ask a question, Captain Wade. Wade stepped closer to the witness stand. Colonel Dietrich, did the Counterintelligence Corps offer new identities to soldiers who witnessed sensitive operations? In some cases, yes, for their protection. Protection from whom? From Soviet intelligence, from enemy agents who might target witnesses. It was for their safety. Or was it to silence them, to prevent them from disclosing war crimes committed by Soviet forces with American knowledge? Dietrich's jaw tightened. I can't speak to speculation about war crimes. I can only speak to documented facts. Then let's talk about documented facts. Wade pulled out another report. This is the autopsy report for Staff Sergeant Robert Mercer. Cause of death, gunshot wound to the head. Manner of death, accidental discharge during detention interview. She looked at Dietrich. You were the officer conducting that interview, weren't you? The courtroom went silent. Dietrich stared at Wade, his composure finally cracking. That file is classified. It was declassified last week in response to our discovery motion, and it shows your signature as the interviewing officer. Wade's voice was steel. Did you kill Staff Sergeant Mercer? Objection! Marsh was on his feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Did you shoot him because he refused to stay silent? Wade didn't look away from Dietrich. Because he wouldn't take the deal? Because he was going to expose what the OSS and Soviet command had agreed to? Dietrich's face had gone white. It was an accident. My sidearm discharged during the interview. The weapon malfunctioned. It wasn't intentional? Wade's voice cut through the courtroom. A career intelligence officer's weapon accidentally discharges during an interrogation, killing the one witness who refused to cooperate, and we're supposed to believe that's coincidence. Morrison slammed her gavel. Captain Wade, you are dangerously close to contempt. Colonel Dietrich is not on trial here. But he should be, Wade said quietly. She turned to Morrison. Your Honor, this man participated in the murder of American soldiers. He silenced witnesses to war crimes. He spent 50 years protecting a conspiracy that buried the truth. And now he's here, lying under oath, trying to bury it again. Morrison's expression was unreadable. The witness will answer the question. Colonel Dietrich, was the death of Staff Sergeant Mercer an accident? Dietrich sat there, trapped. The courtroom waited. Finally he said, It was ruled an accident. That's not what I asked. Dietrich's hands gripped the armrests of the witness chair. His voice, when he spoke, was barely audible. It was necessary. The words hung in the air. Morrison leaned forward. Explain that statement. He wouldn't stay silent, kept insisting he'd go to Congress, to the press, that he'd expose everything. We couldn't allow that. The alliance with the Soviets was fragile. The information he had, what those soldiers witnessed, it would have destroyed diplomatic relations. Dietrich looked at Dylan, and there was something like regret in his eyes. We couldn't let him destroy the peace. So yes, It was necessary. Dylan felt the world tilt. His grandfather hadn't died in an accident. He'd been executed, murdered by the man sitting 10 feet away, confessing it in open court. Wade's voice was quiet. No further questions. Morrison called a recess. The courtroom emptied, leaving Dylan and Wade alone at the defense table. "We got him," Wade said. "He admitted it, confessed to murder on the stand." Dylan couldn't speak, could only think about his grandfather, 28 years old, sitting in a detention cell knowing he was going to die for telling the truth. Wade squeezed his shoulder. "The charges against you won't disappear, but we just proved your investigation was justified, proved the conspiracy was real. When this transcript goes public—" "Will it?" Dylan found his voice. "Morrison can still seal the proceedings, classify everything, make this disappear like they made my grandfather disappear." "She won't. You saw her face. She's going to rule on this, and when she does, the truth comes out." Wade started gathering files. "We're not done yet, but we're winning." Dylan sat in the empty courtroom, staring at the witness stand where Dietrich had sat, where a man had confessed to murder and called it necessary. The trial would continue. Dylan would probably still be convicted, still lose his career, still face prison. But his grandfather's name would be cleared, and the 1,000 soldiers who'd been buried in lies would finally be acknowledged. Sometimes that was enough. Morrison reconvened the court after a 30-minute recess. Dietrich was gone, escorted out by CID, facing his own investigation now. The prosecution table looked shell-shocked. Marsh kept glancing at his files like the answers might have changed during the break. Morrison's expression was granite. "Before we continue, I want to address what just occurred. Colonel Dietrich's testimony has raised serious questions about historical events that fall outside the scope of this trial. However, his admissions are now part of the record and cannot be ignored." She looked at Marsh. "Does the prosecution wish to continue?" Marsh stood slowly. "Your Honor, the prosecution maintains that Lieutenant Mercer violated regulations. Colonel Dietrich's testimony, while disturbing, doesn't change the fact that the defendant broke the law." "Noted. Call your next witness." The prosecution had 3 more witnesses, all testifying to procedural violations, classification breaches, chain of custody failures. Wade didn't fight them hard. The facts were the facts. Dylan had broken the rules. The question now was whether it mattered. When the prosecution rested, Wade called her witnesses. First was Dr. Helen Kovach. She walked the court through her research, the pattern of disappearances, the inconsistencies in casualty reports, the evidence of systematic cover-up spanning multiple units over 3 months in 1945. "Dr. Kovach, based on your research, how many American soldiers were affected by this conspiracy?" "At minimum, 943. Possibly more. Records are incomplete, and some units may have been erased from documentation entirely." "And what happened to these soldiers?" "They were silenced. Some were killed, like Staff Sergeant Mercer. Others were given new identities and forced into hiding. All of them were officially declared dead to prevent their testimony about Soviet war crimes from becoming public." Marsh tried to shake her on cross-examination, but Kovach was unshakable. 30 years of research, hundreds of documents, patterns that couldn't be explained by coincidence. Next, Wade called Margaret Russo Chen. She testified about her father's hidden life, the journal he'd kept, the secret he'd carried for 50 years. About the letter from James Brennan, proving that survivors had lived in hiding, terrified to come forward. "Why didn't your father tell the truth?" Wade asked gently. "Because he was afraid. The OSS had threatened him, given him a new identity, told him he'd be killed if he ever spoke about what happened. He spent his whole life looking over his shoulder." Margaret's voice cracked. "He died believing the secret would die with him. I think he wanted someone to know. He just didn't know how to tell anyone safely." When Wade finished, Marsh declined to cross-examine. What could he say? The woman's father had been forced to live as a ghost. Finally, Wade called Dylan. He took the stand, knowing this was it. His chance to explain, to justify, to make the court understand why he'd done what he'd done. Morrison swore him in, and Wade began. Lieutenant Mercer, why did you remove evidence from the bunker? Because I knew it would disappear. I knew the Army would classify it, seal it, bury it like they buried those soldiers. I couldn't let that happen again. Why not trust the system, trust CID to investigate properly? Because the system is what killed my grandfather. The system made the deal with the Soviets. The system silenced witnesses and lied to families for 50 years. Dylan looked directly at Morrison. I couldn't trust a system that had spent half a century protecting a conspiracy. What did you hope to accomplish? The truth. I wanted families to know their loved ones didn't die the way they were told. I wanted my grandmother to know that her husband survived the war, that he tried to come home, that he was murdered for refusing to stay silent. Dylan's voice was steady. And I wanted those soldiers acknowledged. They deserve more than unmarked graves and classified files. Wade nodded. When you discovered the OSS memo, when you learned about the agreement with Soviet command, what did you think? I thought about all the families who'd been lied to, all the soldiers who'd died trying to tell the truth, and I thought that if I didn't expose this, if I let it stay buried, then their deaths would mean nothing. Even if it meant destroying your career? My career doesn't matter. The truth matters. Wade sat down. Marsh stood for cross-examination. Lieutenant Mercer, you've testified that you couldn't trust the system, but you swore an oath to that system, to follow regulations, maintain security, protect classified information, didn't you? Yes. And you broke that oath. I did. You decided that your judgment was more important than regulations, that your personal mission justified breaking the law. Dylan met Marsh's eyes. Yes? And if every officer made that same decision? If everyone decided to ignore regulations when they felt personally justified? What happens to order, discipline, the chain of command? I don't know. But I know what happens when the chain of command murders soldiers and lies about it, when the system protects criminals and silences witnesses. That's worse than one lieutenant breaking regulations. Marsh's jaw tightened. You don't get to decide which laws to follow, Lieutenant. None of us do. That's anarchy. Then call it anarchy, but at least it's honest. Marsh asked a few more questions, but the damage was done. Dylan had admitted everything. There was no defense in law, only in conscience. When the testimony concluded, Morrison called for closing arguments. Marsh kept it simple. The defendant broke the law. He admits it. His motivations, however sympathetic, do not excuse his actions. The prosecution requests the maximum sentence, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, 10 years confinement. Wade stood for the defense. She didn't argue innocence. Instead, she argued necessity. Your Honor, Lieutenant Mercer broke regulations, but he did so to expose a crime that the Army had been hiding for 50 years, a crime that resulted in the murder of nearly 1,000 American soldiers, a crime that was still being covered up when he discovered it. She gestured toward the evidence table, the journals, the photographs, the letters, the OSS memos. This isn't ancient history. Colonel Dietrich sat in this courtroom today confessing to murder, admitting that he killed Staff Sergeant Mercer because the truth was too dangerous. That conspiracy didn't end in 1945. It continued for decades, through classification and burial and official lies. Wade's voice rose. The defense does not ask for acquittal. Lieutenant Mercer broke the law, and he accepts the consequences. But the defense asks this court to recognize why he broke it, to acknowledge that sometimes the greatest duty is not to regulations, but to truth, to the soldiers who died trying to expose that truth, to the families who deserve to know what really happened to their loved ones. She paused. Lieutenant Mercer will lose his career. He will likely face confinement, but he exposed a conspiracy that needed to be exposed. He gave voice to soldiers who were silenced, and he proved that some truths are worth sacrificing everything to tell. Wade sat down. The courtroom was silent. Morrison looked at Dylan. Lieutenant Mercer, do you have anything to say before I deliberate? Dylan stood. Just one thing, Your Honor. My grandfather was 28 years old when they killed him. He'd survived 2 years of war, German imprisonment, Soviet custody. He made it all the way home, and then his own command murdered him for refusing to lie. His voice didn't waver. I'm 32. I've had 4 more years than he did. Whatever sentence you give me, it's still more life than my grandfather got. So no, Your Honor, I don't regret what I did, and I'd do it again. Morrison's expression was unreadable. The court will recess for deliberation. I'll announce my decision tomorrow morning. She stood, and the courtroom rose with her. As the MPs led Dylan back to confinement, he saw Kovacs in the gallery, nodding with something like pride, saw Margaret Russo-Chen wiping her eyes, saw Wade gathering her files, her face set with determination. The truth was out. Whatever happened now, the conspiracy was exposed. Dylan spent the night in his cell, not sleeping, thinking about his grandfather, about Brennan and Russo, living as ghosts for 50 years, about Eddie Walsh, 19 years old, dying in a bunker and being buried in a latrine, about all the soldiers whose names had been erased, whose deaths had been lied about, whose families had spent lifetimes believing a fiction. At 0900 hours, they brought him back to the courtroom. Morrison entered, everyone stood, and the judge took her seat with a file folder in front of her. Dylan's heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. I've reviewed the evidence and testimony, Morrison began. The facts are not in dispute. Lieutenant Mercer removed evidence from a crime scene, accessed classified materials without authorization, and disclosed classified information to unauthorized personnel. Under normal circumstances, these violations would warrant the maximum sentence. She paused. However, these are not normal circumstances. Marsh started to stand, but Morrison raised a hand. The evidence presented in this trial reveals a systematic conspiracy to silence American soldiers who witnessed war crimes committed by Soviet forces in 1945. That conspiracy involved multiple government agencies and resulted in the murder of at least one soldier, Staff Sergeant Robert Mercer, and the coerced disappearance of numerous others. Morrison's voice was steel. The regulations Lieutenant Mercer violated exist to protect national security. But when those same regulations are used to protect criminals, to hide murders, to perpetuate lies that span half a century, then those regulations become tools of injustice rather than instruments of order. She looked at Dylan. Lieutenant Mercer, you broke the law, but you did so to expose a greater crime, a crime that would have remained hidden if you had followed proper procedure, a crime that this court cannot ignore. Morrison opened her file. On the charges of obstruction of justice and evidence tampering, I find you guilty. These are serious violations that undermine the integrity of investigations. However, given the circumstances, I sentence you to time already served and reduction in rank to second lieutenant. Dylan's breath caught. Time served, 3 weeks in pre-trial confinement. That was nothing. On the charges of unauthorized access to classified materials and disclosure of classified information, I find you guilty. However, the materials in question document criminal activity by government officials. The public interest in disclosure outweighs the security classification. Morrison's expression was firm. I sentence you to forfeiture of 1 month's pay and a formal reprimand. She closed the file. Lieutenant Mercer, you will be released from confinement today. Your service record will reflect these convictions and sentences. Whether you choose to continue your military career is up to you, though I suspect your path forward will be difficult. Morrison looked at the prosecution table. I am also ordering a full investigation into the events of 1945. All classified files related to the 18 soldiers found at Fort Campbell and any related cases involving similar circumstances are to be declassified immediately. The families of these soldiers deserve the truth. She looked at Marsh. And I am referring Colonel Dietrich's testimony to the Judge Advocate General for potential prosecution. His admission under oath constitutes evidence of murder, and justice delayed is not justice denied. Morrison stood. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell. Dylan stood there, barely processing what had just happened. Not Leavenworth, not dishonorable discharge. Time served and a reduction in rank. He'd won, not the way he'd expected, not with acquittal or vindication. But he'd forced the truth into the light, and Morrison had acknowledged it. The conspiracy was exposed. The files would be declassified. The families would know. Wade was grinning. "You beautiful, reckless idiot. You actually did it." Dylan couldn't speak, could only think about his grandfather, about all the soldiers who'd died for this truth, about the fact that it had finally been acknowledged. The MPs removed his handcuffs. Margaret Russo Chen came forward, hugged him without saying anything. Kovach shook his hand, her eyes bright. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said quietly. Dylan nodded. He hoped she was right. 6 months later, Dylan stood in Arlington National Cemetery on a cold morning in May, watching as they dedicated a memorial to the soldiers who disappeared in 1945. The Army had moved quickly once Morrison's order came down. Declassified the files, opened the investigations, contacted the families. 943 names verified, confirmed as casualties of a conspiracy rather than combat. The Secretary of Defense had issued a formal apology. The President had signed legislation authorizing a memorial. It wasn't enough. Could never be enough. But it was something. The memorial was simple, a black granite wall with names carved in alphabetical order, like the Vietnam Wall 50 yards away. At the top, an inscription: "In memory of American soldiers who survived war but not peace." 1945, Dylan stood in the front row, wearing his uniform. Second lieutenant now, the rank reduction permanent. He'd been reassigned to a desk job at the Pentagon, pushing paper, staying out of the way. The Army didn't know what to do with him, couldn't promote him, couldn't punish him further, couldn't quite forgive him for exposing their secrets. So they'd buried him in bureaucracy and hoped he'd quit. He hadn't quit, wouldn't quit. His grandfather hadn't quit, even when it cost him everything. The ceremony was small, families mostly, children and grandchildren of the disappeared soldiers, most of them elderly now, some in wheelchairs. They'd spent lifetimes believing their fathers and uncles had died as heroes. Learning the truth had been devastating, but at least it was truth. Margaret Russo Chen stood beside Dylan. She'd brought her father's dog tags, the real ones he'd hidden for 50 years. They'd added Anthony Russo's name to the wall, acknowledged that Thomas Chen had been a ghost covering a soldier who'd been forced into hiding. Dr. Kovach was there, taking notes for the book she was writing. The full story, from the disappearances through the cover-up to Dylan's investigation. She'd already sold it to a publisher. The advance was going to families who needed it. Colonel Dietrich was not there. He was in Leavenworth, awaiting trial for murder. His confession had been devastating. He'd detailed the entire conspiracy, named names, provided documentation. The OSS officers were dead, but the institutional guilt remained. The Army was still sorting through the damage. Wade stood in the back, watching. She'd been promoted to major after the trial, her career enhanced by the publicity. She'd offered to represent Dylan pro bono for any future issues. He suspected he'd need it. The Secretary of the Army approached the podium. A political appointee, uncomfortable with acknowledging institutional failure, but reading his prepared remarks dutifully. Today we honor soldiers who served their country with distinction, who survived the horrors of war, only to be betrayed by the very institutions they trusted. For 50 years, their sacrifice was hidden. Their truth was buried. Their families were lied to. He looked out at the assembled families. We cannot undo that injustice, cannot give back the decades of not knowing, of believing false narratives, of living with holes in your family histories. But we can acknowledge what happened. We can name the truth, and we can ensure it never happens again. The Secretary read the names, all 943 of them. It took 20 minutes. Dylan listened as they reached the M's. Staff Sergeant Robert James Mercer, 28th Infantry Division. Born 1917, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Captured by enemy forces April 1945. Survived imprisonment and Soviet custody. Murdered by American intelligence officers August 11, 1945, for refusing to remain silent about war crimes he witnessed. He was 28 years old. Dylan's throat went tight. His grandmother had died never knowing, but she'd known Robert Mercer had been a good man An honest man, someone who wouldn't lie even when lying would have saved him. She'd been right about that. She just hadn't known how right. After the ceremony, families approached the wall, touched names, left flowers, stood in silence. Dylan walked to his grandfather's name, traced the letters carved in granite. "I'm sorry it took so long," he said quietly. "Sorry you died alone, trying to do the right thing. Sorry no one believed you for 50 years. He placed his hand flat against the cold stone. "But they know now. Everyone knows. You were right. You were always right." Margaret came to stand beside him. Found her father's name a few rows down, Anthony Russo, though the memorial noted his alias beneath it, also known as Thomas Chen, forced into hiding 1945 to 1992. "Do you think they'd be angry?" she asked. "Our fathers? That it took this long?" "I think they'd be glad someone finally told the truth," Dylan said, "even if it came 50 years too late." They stood there together, two descendants of ghosts, while other families said goodbye to soldiers who'd been officially dead since 1945, but were only now being properly mourned. Dr. Kovach approached with an elderly man in a wheelchair, thin, mid-80s, with sharp eyes that didn't miss anything. "Lieutenant Mercer, I want you to meet someone," Kovach said. "This is Carl Brennan, James Brennan's son." Dylan's heart stopped. He looked at the old man, saw his grandfather's generation staring back, the children left behind, the ones who'd grown up fatherless, who'd been told their fathers died heroes without knowing the truth was darker and more complicated. "Your father kept a journal," Dylan said. "It's how I learned what happened, how I knew to keep looking." Carl Brennan nodded slowly. "My mother told me, before she died. Said my father had written to her once. In 1972. Just one letter, no return address. Said he was alive but couldn't come home. Said he was sorry for leaving us." The old man's voice cracked. "She kept that letter for 20 years before she could tell anyone. Thought people would think she was crazy." "Do you have it? The letter?" "Gave it to Dr. Kovach. For the book." Carl looked at the wall, found his father's name. "He died in Montana. Heart attack, 1973. Buried under a false name in some small-town cemetery. We didn't know where until Dr. Kovach tracked it down." "I'm sorry," Dylan said. "Don't be. You gave him his name back. Gave all of them their names back." Carl extended a shaking hand. Dylan took it carefully. "My father was a good man. He just wanted to come home. Thank you for making sure people know that." They talked for a while, Carl sharing stories his mother had told him, memories of a father he'd barely known, a childhood spent wondering why other kids had fathers, and he didn't. Eventually, Kovach wheeled him away toward other families, other connections being made between the children of the disappeared. Wade joined Dylan at the wall. "The Army's offering you an early retirement, full pension, honorable discharge, medical benefits. They want you gone, but they can't afford to look vindictive after all this." "What if I don't want to go?" "Then you rot at a desk job for the next 15 years and never get promoted past second lieutenant." Wade shrugged. "It's your choice. But Dylan, you won. You exposed the conspiracy, forced the truth out, got them to acknowledge what happened. You don't owe the Army anything else." Dylan looked at his grandfather's name on the wall, thought about Robert Mercer, refusing the easy way out, refusing to stay silent even when silence would have saved his life. "I'll think about it," he said. The memorial dedication ended, families departing slowly, reluctantly, as if leaving meant accepting that their loved ones were truly gone. Dylan stayed until the cemetery was nearly empty, just him and the wall and 943 names that had been buried for 50 years. He thought about James Brennan, dying in Montana with a false name and a secret he couldn't share, about Anthony Russo, living as Thomas Chen for 5 decades, too afraid to contact his family, about Eddie Walsh, 19 years old, dying in a bunker and being buried in darkness, about his grandfather, 28 years old, sitting in a detention cell knowing he was about to die, choosing truth anyway. The truth had cost them everything, but it had survived, carried forward by journals and letters and one stubborn grandson who wouldn't let it stay buried. Dylan saluted the wall, turned and walked toward his car. Behind him, the name stayed carved in granite, permanent, undeniable, true. The memorial would stand for decades, maybe centuries. Long after everyone who remembered these soldiers was dead, the stone would remain. Tourists would walk past, read the inscription, wonder about the story behind it, and they would know that sometimes the deadliest enemies weren't across the battlefield. Sometimes they were on your own side. Sometimes the heroes were the ones who refused to stay silent. Sometimes the truth took 50 years and cost everything to tell. But it was still worth telling. Dylan drove away from Arlington, the memorial shrinking in his rearview mirror. He had work tomorrow, paperwork, meetings, the bureaucratic punishment of a man who'd broken all the rules for the right reasons. He didn't regret it. His grandfather wouldn't have either, and that, in the end, was enough.